The evidence is clear. Even if we manage to dramatically reduce our emissions, global warming is already baked into the system. As well as reducing our emissions, building for climate change is critical for New Zealand's future resilience. And our next panel will consider mitigation and adaptation. It'll be fronted by Tonkin and Taylor climate and resilience specialist, James Hughes. But before James joins us on stage, let's hear from this session's sponsor, Tonkin and Taylor.
What did the city look like when you were a kid, Koro?
It didn't look like this. Bit more green, heaps more trees.
What do you think the future will look like?
E hara te huarahi ki te tau, rima manoa rima takau, I te tarapeke kotahi. He hikoi rautaki kē. Ma te urutonga o te āhuarangi, ma ngā whakataunga o te whakawhiwhinga toitū, ma te punga whakahauhau. Mā mātou he hawhianana ngā ahumahi kia whakaheke tukunga waru. Ma te whakahaumaru, te whakamā, te whakatoitū hoki tō tātou wai Māori. Mā te mahitahi e tutuki I a tātou.
What do you think the future will look like?
I don't really know, but I do know it's going to be very, very different. Let me tell you something that my koro once told me when I was a tamaiti. Ko ngā pai tāwhiti kia tata, ko ngā pai tata whakamaua kia tīna. The potential for tomorrow depends on what we do today.
I ngā mana, I ngā reo, raurangatira mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa. Welcome everyone to this session. My name is James Hughes, ngā mihi kia koutou katoa. I lead our climate change and resilience practice at Tonkin and Taylor, and it's my privilege to convene this panel today. We've got a great lineup of panelists who will provide a range of perspectives on this important topic as we discuss our transition to a zero carbon future. Hopefully most of you caught Bruce Glavich's presentation yesterday, and you would have seen also Sir Peter Gluckman just now, and some very, I guess, thought-provoking and challenging perspectives about what the future might hold. Bruce Glavich reminded us of the level of transformation that is needed in our cities and our countries more broadly and at a global level that we must undergo if we are to transform our economies and societies. As the IPCC have said, the planet is in uncharted territory. And while this conference focuses on a 2050 time horizon, the real challenge is in the next 10 years. This decade is critical, and we've heard that multiple times over the last few days. Bruce Glavich also talked to us about the need to focus on the root causes of vulnerability in our communities, as well as a number of global megatrends where we see increasing polarization, complexity, and uncertainty. And it is this backdrop of uncertainty that I'd like to sort of underpin today's discussion with. How will our transition unfold? What will happen globally at a political level? We don't know. What will happen locally in terms of the policies and drivers of local government and central government? A lot of uncertainty there as well. Along with our trading partners, what will they expect of us in our supply chains and our export markets? What about future technologies and markets and what might evolve at rates and rates of change that are unprecedented? So there are many known unknowns, and there are also a number of unknown unknowns that we need to, I guess, have in the back of our mind if we're able to do so, right? Many private sector and public sector organizations are grappling with these exact questions. And given climate change and transition is such a material consideration for all of us, Many are turning to this relatively old but emergent in the climate context, a new process of scenario assessment. And they're using this because risk assessment and have less utility when there's deep uncertainty. So these scenario planning exercises allow us to test and challenge how resilient our strategies are as a business in the face of an uncertain future. So today we've framed the conversation around 3 scenarios for the future. And you see on the screen there. So we're going to be talking about a green road, a divided road, and in fact, what happens if we have no road to a zero carbon future? I'm going to start by asking our panelists to think about the implications of these scenarios for their sectors or from their perspectives. And given the context of this conference, we will focus our kōrero on the urban environment, which interestingly is where 85% of New Zealanders live. I was surprised when I read that the other day. So I'll briefly describe our scenarios. The first one, the green road. This is where New Zealand follows an ambitious and aggressive pathway, beginning soon, where there are a raft of policies introduced, market and technology changes, and wide societal pressure to transition. The second is a divided road, where we do very little for the next 10 years, and then there is an abrupt and chaotic transition, driven by pressure from our trading partners, lenders, and parts of society to transition abruptly. Society is divided and there's opposition, contestation, and disagreement. And the third scenario is no road, and we don't transition as a globe, and we face the worst impacts of a warming planet. So let's begin with our green road scenario. I'm going to read this out in a bit more detail, then introduce our panel members, and we'll crack into the discussion. So the green road is characterized, and bear in mind that we've invented this ourselves. The green road is a future characterized by New Zealand being a leader in the transition to net zero. Climate change is a core priority of the government, and all decisions are based on limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. From 2025, the entire energy system begins rapid electrification, and associated investment is increased at scale. In terms of our urban environments, there are new regulations implemented to limit low density sprawl and drive compact cities. Minimum densities are required in our town centres. Apartments and mixed-use neighbourhoods are being built everywhere. The carbon price increases significantly, reaching $300 a tonne in 2030. You might think that's unlikely, but you look at we're currently expected it to be around 40 or 50, and now in New Zealand it's already at about $80, $90 a tonne. $300 a tonne in 2030 is this scenario. And this really pushes up the costs of infrastructure, supply chains due to embodied carbon. And this makes investment in construction more difficult, and we need to make some trade-offs. This price plus congestion charging makes it expensive to drive a car, and public transport is subsidised and is beginning to become widely used. Councils are constructing active and public transport routes, however, slowly. The government revises the emissions reduction plan and announces a ban on sale of new petrol vehicles by 2030. So there is the green road scenario. I'm sure you'll agree that that is challenging and disruptive. So let's begin the discussion. I'm going to introduce the panel now, and just going to read out their bios and if they could make their way on stage. So first up, Alec Tang. Alec is a chartered environmentalist and fellow of the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. He has spent the bulk of his career developing and delivering innovative sustainability solutions across business, academia, and the public sector. Most recently, his work is focused on the creation of low-carbon, resilient, and equitable urban environments, initially leading Auckland Council's Chief Sustainability Office through the development of Te Taruki Atawhiri, Auckland's climate plan, and latterly as Director of Sustainability at Kāinga Ora Homes and Communities. Alec also lectures on sustainable business at Auckland University. Dr. Lynn Carter. Dr. Lynn Carter, Kaitahu Kati Māmoe Waitaha and Te Rapuwai, is Chief Advisor Ngaitahu for the Chief Executive at Otago Regional Council. Lynn recently retired from Otago University, where her fields of teaching and research were climate change adaptation, Indigenous knowledge, and Indigenous Māori development. She is widely published in these areas, including her recent book, Indigenous Pacific Knowledge and Climate Change. And since her retirement from the university, Lynn has continued to represent her iwi Kaitahu within her tribal takiwa on a number of committees. Through her work, Lynn continues to have a keen interest in urban and semi-urban development from a Kaitahu regional perspective within the context of climate change adaptation. And lastly, familiar face to us all, Brad Olson, Principal Economist and Director at Infometrics and one of New Zealand's leading economic commentators across TV, radio and print media. With extensive networks across New Zealand's business, media, community and social sectors, Brad brings together a variety of influential views, data and emerging trends to inform and advise key decision makers and the public across New Zealand so they can make better informed decisions. Brad is passionate about using economics to make better informed decisions and can communicate complex and detailed trends in a simple, relatable and useful manner. Right, let's do this. So I'm going to move over there and we'll begin the discussion. If you'd like to pose any questions, you can do on the app. Right, so first up, you've heard the scenario I've posed for the Green Road. And I guess give you an opportunity one by one to sort of respond to this question. Alec, I guess we'll start with you. What does the scenario mean to you or the sectors and communities you represent? And what are the challenges or opportunities you think that presents?
Kia ora, James. Tēnā koutou kua whakakoka mai, nā mihi nui kia koutou, e mihi ane au ki na mana whenua huri noa te whangarui a tara. Really important aspect of that Green Road. And for me, I see a start of the opportunities because we've had a bit of doom and gloom over the last day or so. So let's try and start with opportunities and come to the challenges. For me, there's three things in that Green Road scenario that you highlight. And Sir Peter mentioned one of those, which is that practically every one of those interventions that you talk about has a positive benefit above and beyond the carbon side. If we think about electrification of our vehicles, Minister Wood talked about a recent study around air quality emissions and the impact that we're seeing as a result of fossil fuel combustion. And so we can deal with water quality issues, we can deal with air quality issues through electrification. We know that walking and cycling is better from a well-being and a health and a mental perspective as well as a physical health side. We know that higher performing, more efficient buildings will mean that we actually can deliver financial and energy benefits for the people in those houses. And then finally, building cities that are like 15, 20-minute neighborhoods, collections of places where you have that amenity that Sir Peter talked about within 15, 20-minute walking distance of your home. And in an environment where your kids can walk or cycle safely to school, to sports, to whatever myriad of other activities, actually gives you as a parent more time to be something other than just a taxi, right? So there are so many other benefits that this low carbon transition, this Green Road will provide us. The second thing that I'd say about that Green Road is that it means that we can tackle some underpinning systemic issues like inequity, and social cohesion through that transition. What we know, and speakers have talked about this, is as our current transport systems, our current built environment systems are inequitable. The cost of transport is huge, particularly for people in kaingoora houses. So we recently did a survey of people who live in kaingoora properties, and obviously, or unsurprisingly, car dependence was a big theme that came through insofar as it was easier for them to get to places where they needed to go if they did it by car, but many of them didn't want to because of the cost of owning and operating a vehicle. And actually 40% of those people we surveyed said that they had issues in getting to see friends and families, going to the supermarket or going to medical appointments. 40%. I mean, when was the last time anyone in this room couldn't get to a medical appointment because of the transport issues of getting there? Like most of us haven't, but there were many in our cohort who did. And so there are real issues in inequity that we can address through that system transformation element of a Green Road. And then the final one that I just want to flag is that 1.5 is still impact, right? There are still impacts associated with a 1.5 degree future. Those observant among you who were listening to Bruce Glavovich talk will have seen that at 1.5 hot temperature events, those 1 in 10-year hot temperature events still occur 4 times more frequently than they have historically. 1 in 50-year events, almost 9 times. So that Green Road is actually a really important aspect to redesigning our infrastructure in a way that can cope with those impacts that we will still see at 1.5. And it will mean that we don't waste money building things that we have to then remediate or reconfigure when we see those 1.5 degree elements. So those are some of those opportunities. Just quickly on the challenges, which I think we'll cover on later, is for us to address those equity issues, we need to think about a transition that is just and fair. And that's a challenge for us to do that. At the moment, we are still, I feel, missing a lot of opportunities. We talk about electric vehicles. There is no way that many people in our communities can afford an electric vehicle right now. So we have to think about the implications from an equity sense. We need to think about integration of systems. And again, I think we'll talk about this later on, and a number of speakers have talked about this before, where we can't just think about our infrastructure types in isolation. We need to talk to each other, and we need to talk outside of our classical views of infrastructure. And then the final one, which again, someone has raised recently, is that timing and the nature of the value that we ascribe to infrastructure development. So the timing, someone yesterday talked about, short-term or immediate-term CapEx versus longer-term OpEx. That is one of the critical challenges that we have to address. Otherwise, we will just keep having this discussion about that ongoing.
Great. Kia ora, Alec. Great introduction, great start. I'm going to pass to Lynn now. Lynn, Alex picked up on some of those equity issues. I'd like to just explore that a bit further with you. What does that green road scenario mean in the context of Māori and our more vulnerable communities, sense of home, place, and particularly for our urban communities?
Oh, kia ora, James. And first of all, mihi atu ki te toa rangatira, ne te mana whenua o te Wanganui Atara mai I te Waipounamu, no reira tēnā koutou. So firstly, for kaitahu anyway, and I'm sure for most Māori, iwi and hapu throughout Aotearoa and Te Waipounamu, we accept climate change has been happening for some time now. And the challenges for that or from that have been to things like our whakapapa connections to the landscape. For example, our ability to practice our kaitiakitaka when our mahuka kai are disappearing or moving, as in some cases with some of the seafood. And also the way our rivers, our waterways are changing, the way our landscapes are changing, and our physical whakapapa presence on those landscapes is changing, and I'll talk about one of those in a minute. So the connections to our wahi tupuna, our mahuka kai, and also to the way we can even practice our manaakitaka to our visitors by not being able to provide things that we've been known to provide because there may be scarcity or there may be things that we're needing to do to ensure their resilience and survival. So I guess I think it was Moana Jackson, the late Moana Jackson said, and I hope I've got the words right, we're never alone, we walk in the light of our ancestors, or our tepuna. And I think that's true. And we can see that in our physical whakapapa on the landscape and how that's changing. And of course, a key example from Te Waipounamu is Ngā Roimata o Hini Hokateri or Franz Joseph Glacier. Now, she's an important tupuna for our West Coast hapu and our West Coast whānau. And her grief is clearly plain to see. I mean, her grief was there from the start in the form of the ice, which are her tears. But now, of course, they're disappearing. Her grief becomes our grief because it's about loss. And she is a physical reminder of the loss and the losses that we're going to suffer in the future if we don't change what we're doing. So those whakapapa connections are really important. And one thing that kaitahu are doing is taking a leadership stance, a strong leadership stance. We're not waiting for someone else to come up with the solutions for us. We have decided this is what we need to do. And we have put together our climate change strategy, which I think has been around since 2017, and recently introduced our 8-point climate emissions reduction scheme as well, which covers all aspects of our industry, our commercial operation, our mana whenua marae, our people, everything that we have and hold dear. So we're trying to be really proactive, and I'm pretty sure that other iwi are doing the same thing, and I think it's reflected in climate change strategies with Waikato Tainui, for example, and also Te Arawa, I know, have a very, very strong climate change strategy that they're starting to implement. Yeah. So I think it's naive to think that Māori haven't been thinking about it. We have, and for some time. and we're all taking a leadership stance on how to address what's happening to us and how we can ensure that in the future we will all still be remaining on our landscapes as a physical, practical and strong presence within our own takiwā.
Kia ora, Lynn. Yeah, I think there's a lot to learn from the whole of New Zealand around some of those approaches that are being taken at Kaitau and some of the other examples you've given. I'd like to come back maybe after we've spoken to Brad about the vulnerability question, the just transition issues, right?
Right.
Brad, you're an economist, and you know, you've got your perspective and unique view, I suppose, on the Green Road scenario that we posed. Can you just talk about that, I suppose, in terms of the challenges and that we'll have to overcome from an economic perspective that provides to us, and yeah, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. And kia ora, Koto. I mean, it's interesting, right? Once you get to that position, I think there are some huge opportunities that we can unlock. You know, the weightless exports, a lot of the, you know, the way that we're living, and the opportunities that it provides from an environmental export point of view. You know, customers and consumers the world over will be demanding that sort of focus as we get there. So once we get there, it's quite exciting. But I think, yeah, the pathway is the challenge. I mean, we've got how many years before the scenario kicks in, if you will? It's not long. And I guess I say that Infometrics analysis shows that there's $172 billion worth of infrastructure that's going to be built over the next decade or so. That's network. Only 3.6 of that, 3.6% of that rather, is in electricity generation, which says that, look, we can think about all the electric vehicles and sort of shift and decarbonisation as we want, but given that I think that the transition is the big one here, that to get to that position in 2030, to get to that green road, you've got to start laying the ground foundations of that road first. And I mean, anyone in the roading sector here will probably tell you that you don't just whack on the sort of asphalt or the tar seal and you're done. You've got to build it up. And I think at the moment, I'm worried that we're focusing a lot on that top seal when we're not actually thinking about building the strong foundations, because so far we haven't got that forward look. The other element I think is, or a big shift is going to be factoring in that shift towards the green road alongside the population that is changing among us. I mean, Alec, you talked about, you know, schools and similar. That's all good and well, but actually we've got a lot of older people that are going to come through. I mean, the challenge that was posed last night was imagine where you're going to be in 2050. With the greatest respect, a lot of you in this room are going to be sort of thinking about with walking with strollers or similar. I'll be 53 by that point, so even I'm going to be getting on. Now, I say that because I really do think that that means that the population, which will be a lot older, will also have to be thinking in a sort of smaller, more community-minded circle, because we aren't going to be able to move all that far. And with the population growth, we're not all going to be able to get everyone in large mobility vans that drive around. So I do think we need to quite seriously consider that element. But the wider point, I think, is around that sort of just transition, because we could well find ourselves going down the green road, but some people effectively get dragged kicking and screaming down it. We've done this before. New Zealand did this in the 80s or so. We knew that there were big changes coming and we weren't willing to confront them. All of a sudden, when those changes hit, we made the economy transition, which worked well from an economic point of view, but it meant that some people in society were completely screwed over. And I think we either get on that road with everyone now, or again, there's a fair bit of collateral damage that comes through. You know, I'd be thinking about that carbon dividend idea. How do we actually fund that transition properly so that those who are going to need to transition and wear the cost the most are also supported to do so?
Sorry, can I just jump in, Brad? Because I think you make a really important point earlier on about energy. And so we had the session yesterday with Jody Bricolt around renewable, and all those renewable resources are great. They're fantastic. We're putting solar on kaingoora houses because there's lots of benefits from a energy resilience and a hardship perspective. But we're not going to get to the green road or any kind of conceivable future if we just replace our fuel source, right? Yeah. That's just not going to happen. And there are supply issues, there are challenges around that. And interestingly, some other work that we're doing at kaingoora is around transport. You know, ironically, as a housing agency, actually transport's one of our biggest opportunities. And thinking with the likes of Vector, and this is that cross network and, you know, the importance of doing that. So actually, we need to think really hard about whether or not we can and should provide electrification or opportunities to charge electric vehicles at every property, because that's going to be a massive load, right? Yeah. And also challenges that transport mode shift element. And so we actually can't just electrify. We need to think about reducing our energy usage in a whole manner of different forms, which means that shared mobility that we heard about yesterday, all those kinds of, it's like and, not just one intervention or another.
See, you need to live like me in Wellington, where I live, 20 minutes walk from work. I'm trying to get rid of the car at the moment. I use a Mevo every now and then. It's a nice townhouse. It's nice and suburban, but it's close to the center of town. It's a good way of living. I quite like it. I think more people should give it a crack. Everyone seems to hate it and think that, it'll destroy the great Kiwi dream. I feel like I'm living it.
Yeah. There's a great, sorry, James. Okay. There's a great reframing of the Kiwi dream. So you've got this quarter-acre dream, whereas there's a group that are talking about the quarter-hour paradise, and effectively that mode that it's not. And actually we can't, we don't have enough space. One of the other things that we forget is that we've got this image that we can just keep sprawling and growing, and whether it's carbon emissions or food production or whatever it is, we just don't actually have that much space. And so the importance of a quarter-hour paradise versus that quarter-acre dream is actually a really important transition mentally that we need to go through.
Yeah, it's a really good example.
In there, right. So
jump in.
Back to Brad. Yes, you're right about the economy. We Ngāi Tahu are often called the billion-dollar iwi. I don't know why. And yes, we have a bit of money which we've built up, but that money isn't the means to isn't the end objective. It's a means to an end for us to have choices where we can therefore help the iwi, help the whānau transition into some of the changes and things that we're going to have to make. And just getting back to your point on maybe having power sources in each house to charge an electric car, that's not going to solve the problem of the developers forever sprawling. We need to start thinking more about building communities, not building houses.
Yep.
And so if you looked overseas, there's a lot of examples over there. I think we're going to talk about it a bit more in detail later. Sorry, James. But where there are community vehicles that people can use. So not every house has a garage or a car. And there's a perfect example in a little place called, I've just forgotten the name of it, just north of Dunedin, and they have a community electric vehicle that they live good, I live 40 kilometres out and they live even further, a good hour and a half. And that vehicle is available for people to take into Dunedin itself and do their shopping and carpool and things like that. So it can be done. There's just one little community doing it already.
And I think this is really important because I don't know if Sir Peter's still here, and there's lots of this is what the future looks like, or it's happening now, right? There are interventions that people are putting forward, community, shared vehicles, whether it's a Mevo or whether it's like I think Otatahu Community Housing Trust do something similar, shared bikes, all that kind of stuff. We are doing these kinds of things. And I think it's important to recognize that green road, or a step towards that green road, isn't as far as we think it should be. The other thing I'll flag, which you kind of noted, was this element of green infrastructure community space. And in the housing and transport panel, there was a question that was like, how do we deliver density, but have that community and green space? And my point at Kaingora is you cannot deliver density well without that good design and without that green space, because you'll just create intensification, yes, but it won't be successful.
Exactly.
No one will want to live there. And you're going to not create those strong cohesive networks as a neighborhood that we know is going to be important. And that 1.5 degree future, as we said, is still disrupted. There are still, extreme weather events. There are still vector-borne diseases, all kinds of stuff that will require really strong communities that we're building now, not in the future.
Yeah, look, thanks. Well, I'm just going to weigh in because you guys are dominating the discussion. So I agree with that there's a myth that density can't be delivered in a green way, and people like, as you know, Brett Tederi and the urbanists of the world, they are at pains to say we need good quality transport density and green spaces, and they can all be delivered together. I want to pick up on, I guess, the challenges in the market space. Is the market set up to deliver on this outcome, this green road, or do we need interventions and new models and delivery vehicles that can deliver an urban form in an integrated way at the scale and pace that we need? Personally, I don't think the market's set up to deliver it as it's currently established. I know there's been talk about urban development, urban regeneration agencies. We haven't seen any where I come from and in the various smaller cities around the Bay of Plenty, there are CBDs with 150, 200 empty shops. And we're building new homes out on the in the landscape. So I'm interested in all of your perspectives, Brad. I'll start with you.
I mean, is the market currently set up to deliver it? No. Is full intervention going to make it work either? Also, absolutely not. And I think that the challenge that we have at the moment is that realistically, the incentives for the market aren't working great. And I say that because you look at, I mean, Eric Crampton's I think been referenced probably a few times at this conference and some of his thinking that at the moment, if you go into a council, we know we need more housing development, right? And at the moment, because of how cooked housing has got, we're now willing effectively to throw out a lot of the rules and say, please build wherever you want because we haven't done enough. Now, the risk, and I think this is a valid risk, is that people bring up and say, well, that means we will just have sort of stuff everywhere and we won't have good coordination. Now, I understand that, but also housing is cooked, so we've sort of got to do something. I think the risk that we've got and the way we need to frame it in terms of the right incentives, if you will, is making sure that whether or not you've got an urban development authority or not, if you've got a local council that is dead set against bringing on any more costs because they know that they've got to provide infrastructure that they don't have the money for, we're still on a hiding to nothing. So I think, I mean, that funding conversation that I know is going on and wherever the other room is important. But I think in my mind, the way that I would think about it is that the market, though, does start to cotton on to the right ideas and move in the right way, but often isn't willing or able enough to sort of move it fully along the spectrum. Now, I say that because on the other side, I don't want government doing what it's currently doing at the moment, which is saying you win and you lose because I'm not giving you any money and I'm giving you some. And instead, I sort of wonder if a better way is that you sort of find businesses that have started to take the first step, they're thinking about the right ways to move, and then you fund them because they're already on that pathway. It's sort of like, if you will, if you've got kids and you're down, at the beach or similar, your kids on the boogie board, you help them get onto the wave, but they've already made the intention they want to get onto the wave. You don't throw the kid in just into the middle of the wave, regardless. And I guess I say that because it is important that we're sort of moving in the right pathways. Government can sometimes do some really good things with funding and setting the right parameters, but sometimes government gets a bit too involved. And I think there's that actual element of needing the market to make the right intentions to move forward, and then the government coming in behind to support it. That could be a better way of trying to achieve what we're trying to execute here.
Interesting.
Can I just throw, from an infrastructure perspective, given that we are here, I think two things that I would note that we've talked about, others have talked about, is the system links, right? Yeah. Cross infrastructure investment and actually talking to each other. So two great examples from Kaingoora. One, and I know the urban development guys are somewhere in the room, Freeland Reserve in Roskill development, where we've daylighted a stream, we've created a wetland, which was just a stormwater resource. So as we have that pressure on our space, we need to make more use of the space that we have. So this what was just a place that flooded, a park that had lots of antisocial issues, it didn't go anywhere. It's been opened up. It deals with the stormwater, but it's now actually a walking route to school. And they flip the houses, so they actually look onto the park to try and deal with some of those antisocial issues. So I think noting that you've got to do that in an integrated fashion, and similarly in another part of Roskill, we've been charged with how do you deliver a low carbon neighborhood, and the first thing you have to do is talk to all the different infrastructure providers, in which we can say we're going to build a more efficient house, so therefore Vector and Watercare, your infrastructure doesn't need to be as heavy or weighty as it has. We can deliver a low carbon neighborhood if Auckland Transport, you provide those services at the point of first occupancy. And that's really important that these behaviors get set right at the start. And we need to make sure that those services, whether it's transport or, as Sir Peter said, amenity, daycare is one of those critical ones, aged care, if it's an older community, needs to be there from the start, and there needs to be a coordinated effort.
I think as well, I mean, that requires to be quite serious, central government to get quite real about being willing to interact properly. I mean, I got an email the other day in the private sector, remember, from one government agency saying, hey, where's this information from this government agency, because no one there will talk to me. I mean, when it comes to housing, and I know that's not the entire thing, but it is a large part, who is the lead agency? Is it Kaingoora? Is it the Ministry of Housing and Urban Development? Is it Treasury? Is it MSD? You know, at points we get emails that mean that the lack of coordination, even within the central government element, is a bit cooked. And I think there needs to be a really strong and challenging conversation within government of who is, you know, the chief here who can actually drive things forward, both themselves to lay out the policy, but also to bang some heads together and say, oi, hurry up and figure this out.
But I'd also throw in there, sorry, Lynn, you're stuck in the middle of it. But I'd also throw in there that we can't just talk about housing, right? We can't just talk about building a house. We are needing to build more cohesive communities, which is a wider urban development that involves transport, that involves energy, that involves all these different agencies. And I think the way, and this goes back to like systemic structures that are in our society or economy, that we just create these agencies that deal with transport and an agency that delivers electricity, and we just can't. The future that we're wanting to deliver needs us to be a lot more integrated. And I mean, the great news is the emissions reduction plan has been a step forward. There's been a lot more collaboration, as I understand it, within government around it, but that needs to follow through into the implementation side. Sorry, Lynn.
I've got a mute button here. Right, I'm going to change the topic. We've got about 5 minutes left. Lynn, I want to come to you, and we've spoken largely about this green road scenario, and I want to turn us now to the no road scenario just for a few minutes, and we've also got some questions coming through here as well. The no road is basically saying the globe doesn't transition, and we experience, I guess, and Alec, you've already set the scene that we're going to experience impacts, but under an extreme 3-degree world, we're going to experience more floods, coastal inundation, more extreme impacts from climate change. Lynn, in your opinion, how do we foster communities that are resilient in the face of those challenges? I know you've already outlined a lot that Kaitahu and others are doing, but also, are there different models we should be looking at, both in a transition sense and an affordability sense, in terms of papakainga, in terms of housing options? Your thoughts on those topics.
Well, first of all, we don't think there's going to be a no road scenario. We're into how we are going to be. We're part of the land. The land disappears, we do too. So our whakapapa is totally connected in to that land and the waterways, as I said earlier. So no road doesn't exist in our minds. It may happen, I don't know, it depends what everybody else decides to do.
Exactly.
But certainly for us, it's not there. And I guess some of the ways we're doing that, I mentioned earlier, the 8-point plan. We're looking at our own emissions reduction plan, which will hopefully keep us within our industries anyway, within the 1.5, and it's compatible with the national and global thinking of keeping emissions to that or keeping the warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And we're hoping to get to zero carbon. And yes, Ngāi Tahu have dairy farms. We also have forestry. But within those, for the last 3 years, for example, with our dairy farm, with dairy farms, we've been experimenting with different types of mixtures of grasses that not only help improve the soil quality, so therefore not so much reliance on fertilizer. We've been changing from synthetic fertilizers to more natural fertilizers. We've been looking at different feed within the grasses for our cows for lower emissions. So we've been looking already for 3 years now about how we can adjust our dairy farms to a low emission business. Our jet boat businesses, our tourism businesses, we've just had a launching of our first electric jet boat. So, okay, it's not at a commercial level yet because there's still experimentation as to how much, we've got to find out how long will a charge last, etc., all those practical things. Within our marae, we're looking at renewable energy. So we're already striving to maintain things on that green road. As I said, we can't afford to have a no road scenario because, well, it won't happen and we won't happen. And I guess we're making these strides, we're doing all these things, but not in isolation. We work with scientists, we work with other groups, we have relationships and partnerships that have been nurtured over time. And I guess so whatever is good for us is going to be good for the rest of the communities that share our takiwā. So I just find that's one way of looking at it, which is different than just being, okay, there's challenges, but we're not going to allow it to get to that various levels. But just on that, I think, and getting back to the earlier conversation around the co-housing, the building communities, I think there's already a model out there that severally we have taken, we have been doing for generations, and that's papakainga housing, which centres around your community areas, your marae. It centres your kaumātua, it's intergenerational. People have support networks built up around that. There's a great one that's been set up in Northland on their own lands up there. Bluff, I think Kāinga Ora helped our marae at Bluff, Te Rau Aroha, to build a papakainga housing area for the kaumātua so that they would be part of and a very integral part of the day-to-day lives of everybody within that rūnaka. But probably the best example is the one that Ngāti Whātua have done at Ōrākei. I mean, we're talking about an iwi that is surrounded by our biggest city. They've been pushed over time to a tiny little space. They fought hard, got their marae area back, got back Takaparafa. You know, they've had a lot of challenges in terms of maintaining their presence within their own takiwa or in their own tūranga waiwai in our biggest city. And their kāinga tuatahi, I think it's called, their 30-house development is strictly along tikanga whakapapa lines. It's about intergenerational. It's not self-sufficient so much, but it's uses renewable energy. I think they have a Tesla, one of those big Tesla batteries, which helps with the solar energy, power storage and things like that. So they have created another community around, which is surrounded by a rather large other community. Within their marae, with their marae being the centre of it. They're there within their whakapapa landscape, their cultural landscape, and that's a huge success story for them. And I know they're looking at expanding on that. And so the challenges that they've faced in the past, you know, have culminated in their resilience and I guess their ways of looking to what did our tupuna do, how have they walked in the light of their tupuna and made those adjustments and changes in their own way to suit their own, I guess, their own identity, their own way of who they are. And so I think another really good example in Auckland is Earth Song, which has been going for how long now, 30 years? But some of the biggest barriers to co-housing, and we see it in Dunedin, are the regulations and the building codes and all those things that govern what you can do on your land. And I think that's points. a huge issue. Until we overcome those barriers, I don't know what we can do.
I agree. We had that discussion yesterday, didn't we, about those barriers? Thanks for adding that in as well. Look, we are over time. I'm going to draw it to a close. Kia ora and thank you, each of you, for your contributions. I think we could have gone on for many hours on this topic. You didn't even need me here. So yeah, just in closing, look, thanks everybody for your contributions. I'm sorry we didn't get to the questions on the app. So come and see us afterwards if you want to explore any of those with the panelists. On behalf of myself and Tonkin and Taylor, thanks to the panel. Can you please put your hands together and thank you.